Sarah, and I'm back to continue our series on trans identities and allyship. So today we're going to talk about some common myths about transgender folks, transgender community, all of those things. So the first myth I want to start with is this idea that transgender people are confused about their identity, confused about who they are. An important place to start with this idea is that transgender identity is a natural variation of human gender expression. There is a growing body of biological research and psychological research looking at the genetic components of gender identity. A couple key examples that really are starting to support the fact that transgender identity is a natural phenomenon is that trans women, when looking at brain studies, MRIs, fMRIs, trans women have brains that looks more similar to cisgender women than cisgender men, showing that they have more in common with the gender they identify with as opposed to the gender they were assigned at birth. Another key point of research comes when we look at twin studies, which compare identical twins that are the closest thing we have to real biological clones, and fraternal twins, which have genetics pretty similar to just a regular brother, sister, two other siblings. And both of them grow up in the same environment, same household, all of those things. But when we look at the data, identical twins, if one of them is transgender, there's a 20% chance the other is transgender. This compares to fraternal twins, where if one is transgender, there's only a 2.6% chance that the other is transgender. So it's almost 10 times more likely in identical twins compared to just regular siblings. One of the reasons that people are really worried about this myth is this fear of detransitioning, which means people who go through the transition process come to regret it, come to decide it's not for them, and then retransition essentially, go back to the gender they were assigned at birth. Not only is this uncommon, when we actually look around the statistics around regret and transitioning, 98.4% of people that transition medically, socially, legally experience no regret after transitioning. And of the roughly 2% that do, most of it is because of the stigma they face as a trans person, or the way that they're treated, attitudes from family, loved ones, all other members of their community, and a lot less of it is actually from gender confusion itself. The second myth I want to talk about is this idea that being transgender, whether being a trans woman, trans man, non-binary, this is a new fad. So the reality of it is that gender expressions outside of man and woman are not new. Gender diverse identities have been around for thousands of years, if not longer. We've seen histories and records of gender diversity in all inhabited continents around the world. A couple examples that are definitely worth further research are in ancient Egypt, there was a third gender called Sekhet that had a symbol in hieroglyphics that was separate from the other two genders. When we look at indigenous cultures in the Americas, there is a pan-indigenous term called two-spirit. So it does vary from tribe to tribe. Generally, it encompasses gender identities that either combine masculine and feminine traits or show kind of that point of transitioning from one to the other. A more specific example is in the Navajo Nation. They actually recognize 4 distinct genders, including cis men, cis women, and then a masculine assigned female at birth gender, and a feminine gender for assigned male at birth people. In South Asia, countries like India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, there is an identity called Hijra. This is a feminine person who is assigned male at birth. And while there are 2 million people that identify as Hijra today, this is also a tradition that goes back to ancient times. There are mentions of Hijra in the Kama Sutra. In Hawaii, we see Mahu identity, which roughly translates to in the middle. These are folks that may be assigned male at birth, assigned female at birth, intersex, who don't identify as a man or a woman, identify with a third gender. These are just some brief examples, and they are definitely worth looking up, learning more about, because a lot of them had a lot of cultural importance in religious ceremonies, different ceremonies all around, and definitely worth learning more about for sure. One big thing that is in common with a lot of these identities all around the world is that up until Western colonialism, they were integrated into society, but once colonists came in, they often outlawed gender diverse expressions. While we see less influence of Western countries in a lot of these areas, there is still stigmas that linger today because of those changes. But overall, the important thing with this myth is to know that these identities are not new by any means, but in a lot of ways, they are making a comeback. The third myth I want to talk about is this idea that trans people have mental disorders, that mental disorders are inherent in trans identity. So it's true with trans folks, the same with a lot of queer folks in general, that they experience higher rates of depression, anxiety, substance use, and suicidal ideation. However, this does not mean that trans equals mentally ill. When we actually break down the research and look at the things, the trends, the different correlations, we know that positive social support decreases the, the possibility of mental distress, the occurrence of different mental illnesses, the occurrence of suicidal ideation. The biggest thing we notice too is that acceptance from family, peers, community, religious communities, that alone is one of the biggest things at reducing suicidality in trans folks, especially trans youth. So this really comes back to the fact that being trans is not a mental disorder, but being minoritized and discriminated against increases your risks of having mental distress. The more acceptance we have towards others, the more that we foster an environment that accepts people regardless of gender, this will lead to less mental illness overall for these communities. The fourth myth that I want to go over is this idea that gender identity and sexuality are inherently linked, are completely linked together, which this is a common misconception. It's usually not even ill meaning, it just comes from a place of confusion. So it's important to know the distinctions between gender and sexuality. When we talk about gender, this refers to one's personal identity. So this is about who you see yourself as. This is all internal, first person kind of perspective. When it comes to sexuality, this refers to who you're attracted to, romantically, sexually, emotionally. Sexuality is really about the second person, the one person and another person, the connection between them. While many people who are trans may identify as gay, lesbian, bisexual, not all of them do. It is possible, and there are a lot of people who are trans that identify as straight or heterosexual. It's also important to note when we talk about sexuality in the trans community that transgender sexuality is not dependent on the sex assigned at birth. It usually correlates with the gender that they express later in life or the gender that they identify as. So what I mean by this is if a trans woman is dating a cis man, she is not inherently gay. She may identify as straight, heterosexual, maybe even bisexual or pansexual. She is a woman at the end of the day. She's a woman dating a man. And the inverse is correct as well, that dating a trans person doesn't change your sexuality. If you're a straight man and that's how you identify and you begin dating a trans woman, you're still straight. You're still dating a woman. The last myth I want to cover today, and this is something I'll cover briefly, go a little bit further into in a later video, is this idea that children are too young to know their gender. So children are more in touch with the world around us than we give them credit for. Research shows that children become aware of their gender and other people's genders beyond just he, she, around the ages of 18 to 24 months. Research also shows that transgender kids show as much certainty about their gender as cisgender kids. People who are transgender that are interviewed about their youth have reported being as young as 3 years old when they know that they aren't the gender they were assigned at birth. It can be difficult for parents to really gauge, like, is this normal exploration? Is this normal gender exploration? Or is my child identifying as something other than the gender they were assigned? So the good rule of thumb here is this idea of consistent, persistent, insistent. So if a child is consistent, persistent, insistent about identifying a specific way, that's a good marker that that is who they are. That is the identity that they're gonna carry with them into the rest of their life. It's also important to know when we talk about children and identity that transitioning is usually only social to begin with. I know that a lot of times there is a lot of concern when it comes to medical transition with children. Usually, the only medical options that really are taken into account are around puberty, maybe medications to either reduce puberty, block puberty, or taking hormones that are more consistent with their gender identity. For both cisgender and transgender children, though, coming back to the main point, is allowing open gender expression leads to increased self-esteem and mental well-being, regardless of your gender. So I hope with this video you were able to learn something new about the messages you've previously received about trans folks. In our next video, look forward to us going more in depth on what it means to be non-binary. Thank you.